So we are coming down the home stretch here. You feel it in John. We're in chapter 18. There's 21 chapters. We're coming to the cross and the resurrection. We've timed it that's how we're going to end John on Easter week. And actually, this chapter 21 is post-resurrection. So the week after Easter, we'll finish John. Last week, we looked at Jesus' arrest, and we looked at Peter's denial. And we saw how even in an apparent moment of weakness, Jesus is being arrested. We saw, though, that in fact, he is in complete control of the situation. We're going to see that even now as we go into the trial, the kangaroo court of a sham of a trial that they're going to put Jesus through in the middle of the night. So many illegal things happened, but we're going to see Jesus, even though he seems like the victim, he is actually the victor, and he's in complete control of the whole situation. I was thinking about this week. I was thinking about Peter and what we talked about last week. I said, I think there's a bit of Peter in all of us. And, one of the things I didn't talk about but struck me even this week is how seemingly courageous Peter was in the moment, right? Like in the face of danger, the guy didn't shrink back. He would be a guy you'd want on your team, right? Like a guy that has your back. We didn't talk about this last week, but when the guards showed, the Roman guards and the Jewish guards showed up, there's the word for the amount of people that show, it's the word cohort. And cohort could mean anywhere from 12 to 600. Like, it could have been a very large group of people that showed up to arrest Jesus in the garden. And so Peter pulls out his sword in a moment of just bravery and starts ready to fight again, like completely outnumbered. And it's like, man, he's so bold and so... That takes courage. You can say it's stupid courage, but it's courage nonetheless to do that. And so how brave, how courageous was Peter in that moment? And then not even an hour later, he's coming into the courtyard, and a teenage girl who's guarding the door, whose door is to open it, he cowers in front of him and says, no, I don't even know the guy, right? From a moment of sheer bravery and courage to less than an hour later, like a coward. And I thought, man, there is a lot of Peter in me and in us, right? And we can be so fickle in our relationship with God sometimes, can't we? Where it's like, where things are going good and we're running strong and we're being courageous and being brave. And then there's other times where we just chicken out and we don't walk by faith, we walk by sight. And it's like, I think there's a lot of Peter in all of us. So anyway, Jesus is arrested. That's where we're going to pick up. We're going to look at the trial of Jesus. He remains submissive through the trial, yet he's in complete control. Last week we read this part. I want to read it again to set the stage. We read verse 12. It says, the company, that's the word there for company. The company is that range. It could mean up to 600 people. The company of soldiers, the commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus, tied him up. First, they led him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. So there's no higher position in the Jewish faith. The high priest is the president of the Jewish faith of Israel, right? So Caiaphas is the high priest. Annas was his father-in-law. And was a former high priest. And so Caiaphas, John told us last week, Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews, it'd be better for one man to die for the people, right? He said that back in chapter 11. If you remember John chapter 11, Caiaphas was the one who said, let's kill Jesus before this thing turns into an uproar. He was completely looking out. He's like, let's not upset Rome, our occupiers. It's better to have one guy killed than to stir up the hornet's nest here. He was the brilliant guy who decided it's time to kill Jesus. And so we pick up the scene today in the household of Annas, the father-in-law. And he holds no office. He does not have a position. He's just a former high priest. He's the father-in-law. Much like our office of president, though, he still carries the title, like you still call former presidents president, right, in a show of respect, even though they're not an acting president. And much like here, former presidents still carry a sway and have some influence. Annas, even though he's not the high priest, we're going to see he still has influence. And so this sham of a trial that they're going to put Jesus through, let me just kind of give you a little bit of background. There's 6 parts that ends up happening during the night. John doesn't do all 6. He just focuses on a couple of them. Let me show you what the 6 parts are. There's 3 parts of Jewish and 3 parts of the Roman court, right? It starts here. We're going to be in part 1. Starts at Annas' house. He was the high priest, father-in-law, right? So holds no office, former high priest. That's where we're at now. Then Jesus is going to get sent to Caiaphas, who is the acting high priest. And then Caiaphas is going to send Jesus off to the Sanhedrin, which is basically the Supreme Court. Think Supreme Court of ancient Israel. Right? There were 71 of them acting as elders that were there as spiritual judges. And so Jesus is getting passed around. They decide we're going to kill him. But they don't have the authority to kill them under a prisoner under Roman rule. Only Romans can kill. And so let's send them off to the Roman court. So that's when Pilate gets involved, who was the governor of Judea and Samaria region. Pilate decides he doesn't want to do anything. Let me ship Jesus off to Herod. Herod was in town because it was Passover. It was the largest Jewish celebration. Literally thousands of Israelites coming in from around to Jerusalem. And so extra Roman guards, Herod came in and was staying in Jerusalem during this time. He was the ruler of Galilee up north where Jesus was from, but he was in town in Jerusalem for this. Herod decides he doesn't want to do anything with him, sends him back to Pilate. So Jesus, in the middle of the night from like 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., is getting shifted around in these 6 different places. John doesn't cover them all. We'll just see as we go. He's going to start with talking about Annas. Really, basically, John covers Annas. He doesn't cover Caiaphas. He doesn't cover the Sanhedrin. He's going to go pretty quickly to the Roman court. And I've called it the sham of a trial, a kangaroo court, because it really is. There's at least 6 things that happened that were illegal, that made this trial just invalid. And illegal court proceeding. Even back in those days, there were court laws and there was a legal system about how a fair trial should be run. So let me just real quick share with you 6 things. And I share all this with you so that you can know how Jesus was being wronged, and yet how he acted when he was being wronged. There is something we can learn from Jesus about how to be Jesus-like in a situation where we're being wronged, and how do we walk through that? All right. So here's six things that were unethical about this night trial. Number 1 is the fact that it starts with Annas, who held no official position. He was not in office. He had no position. Yet he's the first to interrogate Jesus. Number 2, it was happening in the middle of the night. There was Jewish law said there was no court session that was supposed to happen before the morning sacrifice. Every day there was a morning sacrifice in the temple, and there could be no legal proceedings before the morning sacrifice. This was happening during the middle of the night. There was supposed to be no court being held on the Sabbath day or on a holy day. It's both. It's Sabbath and it's Passover. They violate that. Illegal proceeding number 4 is a trial that ended in a pronounced death sentence was supposed to be sat on overnight. You couldn't have a trial, a sentence, and an execution happen in the same day. They built in kind of a mechanism to just, let's be sure, we have to sleep on it overnight. That didn't happen. Number 5, they brought no actual evidence against Jesus. Matthew tells us they tried to drum up some false witnesses. They tried to get people to, hey, come bear false testimony. Nobody would do it. Eventually they found 2 to come and kind of share false testimony. But they had 0 evidence brought against Jesus. And then lastly, they end up switching charges after they go from the Jewish court. In the Jewish court, their charge was, because the Jewish court is all about theology. It's all about their doctrine. It's about their religion. And so the charge against Jesus is blasphemy. He claimed to be God. This man claimed to be God. And so they're going to kill him because he claimed to be God. when you get to the Roman court, they don't care about the Jewish theology and what they believe. They're more concerned about the law. And so the Jews switched the charges from Jesus from blasphemy to now they're going to bring charges of treason. That he's a revolutionary. He's claiming to be a king. He's threatening King Caesar. And so treason. And so they switched the charges between. And so many things. There's probably a couple others that for the sake of time this morning, we're just going to move on. Jesus is an innocent man. He's being harmed. He's being wronged. Yet, he's not a victim. Right? Because a true victim is not in control. A victim doesn't have control of the outcome or the circumstances, and Jesus is in complete control of the whole situation. And so here we are. All that to say, we're at step one. All right, we're at the beginning. Jesus is in Annas' house. Okay, and it goes like this. Verse 19. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching, right? So he's asking questions about these two areas, your disciples and your teaching. How many followers you got? How big is your group? How big's your following? What kind of things are you saying, right? Jesus responds, I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus answered him. I've always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all the Jews gather. And I haven't spoken anything in secret, right? Jesus is basically saying, I've been speaking about this for 3 years, out in the open, out in the public, where all y'all gather, in the synagogue and in the temple. There's been no secret, right? It's interesting, and Jesus giving his answer here, they were asking about two areas, and Jesus does not say anything about his disciples. And commentators note that even here, in his answer, Jesus is still protecting his disciples. As he prayed, right, even in the garden, he said, let these men go. Even in his answer before the high priest or the former high priest, Jesus decides, I'm not answering about my disciples. You're not going to go after my guys. And Jesus is still protecting his disciples. Ironically, this is happening, right? When I told you there's the courtyard, Annas' house is over here. Jesus is inside Annas' house being interrogated. While Jesus is inside protecting his disciples, Peter is on the outside denying he even knows the man on the inside. It goes on and says in verse 21, Jesus says, why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Like, ask anybody. Go ahead and ask anybody. Look, they know what I said. Verse 22, when he had said these things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, is this the way you answer the high priest? Verse 23, Jesus says, if I've spoken wrongly, Jesus answered him, give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, then why do you hit me? Verse 24, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Right? So it's at this point, probably, remember I told you last week, at the instant that the rooster crowed, Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus and Peter's eyes, they saw each other. Right? So it's probably here at this moment that as Jesus is leaving the house, Annas sends him out, go over to Caiaphas' house. Jesus leaves. He's coming out of the house into the courtyard. It's probably at that moment the rooster crows and Peter and Jesus' eyes meet. And Jesus says, can you go back one verse for me to verse 23? Jesus says in verse 23, if I've spoken wrongly, Jesus said, give evidence. Bring some evidence as to what wrong I've done. You know how much evidence they're going to bring? Zero. None. Why? Because there is no evidence. So listen, when you follow the truth, when you live your life according to the truth, when you believe in the truth, you obey the truth, there's no charge that can be brought against you. There is no evidence. And it's an invitation from us to Jesus is our master. We're following him, that we should live our lives in the truth, with the truth, following the truth, studying the truth, reading the truth, believing the truth, and then obeying the truth. And when you live that way, they might bring accusation against you, but there will be no evidence because you've been like Jesus. You've followed and walked in the truth. This is the way we as followers of Jesus are to live our lives. So he goes off to Caiaphas and then is going to go to the Sanhedrin. John decides not to cover either of those parts. And we're going to just jump right to Pilate. When he goes to Caiaphas and then to the Sanhedrin, this is where they're trying to drum up charges. They're trying to bring witnesses. They get 2 witnesses that will lie and say he did this and he did this. You can read about that in the other Gospels if you want. It's here at Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. They blindfold Jesus. They put a blindfold on him. And they strike him in the face. And they say, prophesy now. Who was it that hit you? And this is where that starts. And so the Sanhedrin finds him guilty of blasphemy and sentences him to death. Only under Roman law, the Jews don't have permission to execute somebody. So they send him off to Pilate's house. So just a reminder to you of where we're at in the court system here, right? Skip in Caiaphas, John doesn't cover. Skip in the Sanhedrin, John doesn't cover. And now we're going to Pilate. John's not going to cover Herod either. He's just going to cover the interaction with Pilate. Herod was a horrible king. This is not the Herod that had all the babies killed when Mary and Joseph fled and went to Egypt, right? That was this guy's father. This guy's dad is the one that killed all the babies. He died, and he divided up his territory between his 3 sons. And so this is Herod, son number 3. Herod Antipas is his name. And he was a horrible king like his father. He had heard about Jesus. You can read about it again in the other Gospels. He wanted to see Jesus. And so when Jesus gets sent to him, he's like, basically he's like, I want to see a miracle. Do a trick for me. Like, let me see something here. Like and Jesus refuses to be like a monkey to do a trick before Herod. And so Herod sends him away angrily back to Pilate. John skips all of that. John is just going to focus here on going to Pilate. Okay? Verse 28. They led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, to Pilate's house. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves. Otherwise, they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. Okay? So Pilate is in town because of the Passover. And you got to see the irony here. The irony here of these Jews who are wanting to honor God and believe they're doing so by the letter of the law. They stop at the front porch of Pilate's house because no Jew could enter the house of a Gentile or else they would become unclean, ceremonially unclean, and they would not be able to participate then in the Sabbath or in the Passover meal. So they are following the letter of God's law while they're trying to kill God. They want to make sure they can have the Passover meal while they're trying to kill the one the Passover points to, the Passover lamb who is standing right in front. I mean, the irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. And so they're not going to go into Pilate's place because we don't want to dirty ourselves, but we've got to kill this guy. We're trying to honor God. You know, that's kind of what religion does and self-righteousness does. Self-righteousness lives in such a way that they can't see the plank in their own eye. You can't see the ugliness of your hypocrisy by living in an air of self-righteousness. They were blind. They were blind to their own wickedness. And so Pilate comes out to them. Verse 29, it says, So Pilate came out to them and said, What charge do you bring against this man? And they answered him, If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. Nice non-answer to the question. Did you notice that? Right? What charge do you bring? Well, we wouldn't be here if he wasn't guilty now, would we? Is basically what they're saying. But they don't even give an answer. And so Pilate replies, you take him and you judge him according to your law. Pilate from the get-go wanted nothing to do with this Jewish problem, this Jewish theology doctrine problem. He's like, listen, you figure it out in your own courts, in your own laws. I don't want to get involved in this. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want a big stink happening. Why? It was Passover. There was already chaos in the city. Again, the city was like almost doubled because of all the Jews coming in from all different. And so already extra guards, already chaos, right? It was already just, listen, I don't want to be dealing with this right now. You guys deal with it, Pilate says. It's not legal for us to put anyone to death, the Jews declared. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled. What were Jesus' words? Indicating what kind of death he was going to die. Do you remember what Jesus' words were? I didn't either. I had to look it up, and it was in John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, remember John chapter 3? It's okay, we'll read it again. John chapter 3 that we did about 9 months ago. In John chapter 3, Jesus said this, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Now, when Jesus said this in John chapter 3, his hearers had no idea what he was talking about, the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, John remembers what Jesus said and says this, that he's answering. Can you go back to the verse to John 18? He says this, that Jesus' words are going to be fulfilled. How are Jesus' words going to be fulfilled? Well, see, if the Jews were going to kill somebody before Rome was even occupied, and if even sometimes they still did it illegally, the Jewish way of killing people, if you were a prophet and your prophecy was wrong, it was found to be false, they would kill you by stoning. That was the Jewish way. Stoning was they would knock you down, and then kill you with stones. The Roman way of killing was not by stoning. Rather, the Roman way of killing was to lay you on a cross, nail you to it, and raise you up and put you on a cross. And so Jesus, way back in John chapter 3, knew he wasn't going to die at the hands of his own people, the Jewish way. He knew he was going to die the Roman way, that he was going to be raised up, laid on a cross, and dropped in the ground as the cross gets raised up. And so John is pointing out, even in this trial, Jesus is in control. He knew exactly what he said, and he knew what kind of death he was going to die. Verse 33 says this, Pilate went back into his headquarters and summoned Jesus. So now Pilate goes back into his house, and he calls Jesus back into his house. And he's going to have a private conversation with Jesus. And Pilate says to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Right? Now listen, Pilate is not asking theological questions. He's not asking religious questions. He's not trying to understand the Jewish faith. He's not trying to understand doctrine. What kind of questions is he asking? He's asking political questions. He wants to know, are you a king? Do you have subjects? Do you have an army? Are you a revolutionary? Do I need to be afraid? Do we need to warn Caesar? Are you trying to overthrow our king? These are the kinds of questions that Pilate is asking. Political questions. Government type questions. He's trying to discern, is Jesus a threat to Rome? And Jesus answered, are you seeking this on your own, or have others told you about me? And Pilate replies, I'm not a Jew, am I? And, again, it's hard to read tone in a text. I think it's totally appropriate to knowing Pilate when he's, I'm not a Jew, am I? Seriously, I don't know your people's ways and their laws, and I don't know if you're a king. I'm not a Jew, am I? That's right. A tone of disgust. Pilate replies, and then he says this, look, your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. Right? So here's the question. What have you done? Now, what have you done? Picture your answer. Picture you're Jesus at this point, without being blasphemous or irreligious. Picture you're in this situation. You're there. You're being grilled by the Roman official. And he says, look, just tell me, what have you done? What would your answer have been? I mean, Jesus at this point could have said anything, right? He could have pled his innocence. He could have remained silent. He could have walked through everything that he's done in the last 33 years since he's been here. He could have talked about how in eternity past he existed and he helped create the world. Like he could have given any answer. But when asked by a political ruling official trying to discern Jesus' political agenda and says, what have you done? This is the answer Jesus gives. And I believe it's informative to us today in this highly political, divided nation that we're currently living in. And I think it speaks to us, brothers and sisters, as family members of God. I think it speaks to us that Jesus' answer gives us some truth here to follow. Here is Jesus' answer. When asked, what have you done? His answer is, my kingdom is not of this world, said Jesus. If my kingdom were of this world, if it was about this world, if it was about a way of life in this world, Jesus said, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. Jesus says, but as it is, my kingdom is not from here. And so Jesus answers the question. I am a king, but I'm not a king, Pilate, the way that you think king and see king. See, Jesus wasn't interested in taking over Pilate's rule. Jesus wasn't interested in taking over a governmental structure. He wasn't interested in hoisting the Christian life forcefully over a group of people. He's like, listen, there's a whole nother thing going on here, that I'm a king, but my kingdom is not here. It's a spiritual kingdom. It's realized by faith, and I'm after people's hearts, not after political power. And so, listen, all of this isn't even going to be here in a while. I'm talking about eternity at stake. It's a spiritual kingdom that you don't see with the human eyes. Right? It's a kingdom where in my kingdom, there's different principles in my kingdom. It's not a kingdom that is going to be taken by force. This is essentially what Jesus was saying. If it were so, Jesus is like, yeah, I'd rally the troops to fight. It'd be go time. Except it's not a kingdom that's going to be taken over by force. It's not a cause that we're fighting for here on this earth. It's a spiritual kingdom. As a matter of fact, when he was arrested, John didn't cover it, but the other gospel writers do. When Peter pulls out his sword and lops off Malchus's ear, Jesus says, put away your sword. And then he records in the other gospel writers, don't you know that I could what? Some of you know what? I could call on tens of thousands of angels to come and to snuff this thing out like quick, right? Don't you know I could do this? This could be over. Jesus is like, but this is not the way we fight. This is not what I'm about. I'm not about this earthly kingdom fighting for an earthly cause by earthly means. Jesus has said, I've got a different kingdom. I'm after people's hearts. I'm after eternity. And so when you live and follow this king in his kingdom, it's very different. We've talked about this. It's very kingdom principles different from this. This kingdom is taken by force. It's about power. It's about authority. It's about fight. It's about self. It's about pride. It's about winning. Jesus' kingdom is the complete opposite. He says ridiculous things like turn the other cheek. The first is going to be last. Pick up your cross and follow me. Like, this is a kingdom that is subversive to the ways of this kingdom. I think Jesus reveals a very important kingdom principle for us and his kingdom people to grasp. And I believe the kingdom principle that Jesus is saying here when he says this is this to his followers by way of extension, is you cannot fight a spiritual kingdom war with earthly kingdom tactics. He could have. But he didn't. And in the moment when it was like the most pressure on him to like, what have you done? He's like, I'm not about this kingdom. I'm about a different kingdom. It's a completely different game with different principles, different rules, different purpose, different mission, different goals, different value system. So much so that then you read the New Testament and you read how they fought the kingdom war of this kingdom. And what does it look like to be a part of that kingdom? While you're living in this physical world, how do you live by these kingdoms? And Paul would say things like that. Here's the tactics of this kingdom. Here's how you fight this kingdom war. 2 Corinthians 11. 3 times Paul says, I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I've spent a night and a day in the open sea. On frequent journeys, I faced dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brothers, toil and hardship, many sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, often without food, cold and without clothing. Not to mention other things. There's the daily pressure on me, my concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I do not burn with indignation, Paul says. If boasting is necessary, then I will boast about my weaknesses. Boast about your weaknesses. Yeah. See, this is an upside-down kingdom over here. And this is a king that calls us to different ways of life. And so, in Romans 5, we see that we've also obtained access through him, through Jesus, by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. It's all about a future kingdom that we get to experience partially now, fully when we're with him. But now we're supposed to bring his kingdom to earth. That's what Jesus literally taught his disciples how to pray. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, just like it is in heaven. And so now it says not only that, but we also boast in our afflictions. Who boasts about that stuff? I haven't seen, and I've been on Facebook for like 17 years. I haven't seen anyone boasting about their affliction. I see them boasting about their vacations and their remodels and their new cars and their kids. And I haven't seen anyone boasting about afflictions. Because we know that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope. And this hope will not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. See, this is a kingdom that's after people's hearts. And the way you fight a spiritual war that's after people's hearts is not the same way that you would fight a physical war. And this is what Jesus wants Pilate to understand and tells his followers how to fight. It's interesting. The only time Jesus mentioned Caesar's name in his whole time of ministry, which was, by the way, occupied by Rome, oppressed by the Roman Empire. I mean, if ever there was somebody who should have pushed back against what was happening to their nation, it would have been Jesus, like fighting against Rome. The only time he mentions anything about Caesar is when questioned about money and giving, and he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. It's the only time he mentions the word Caesar in answering that question. And so, for us here today who are fighting a different kingdom war that's after people's hearts, listen, here's the thing. There's only one person that can change people's hearts. Jesus. The only way your heart and my heart has ever been changed is Jesus. He's the one that can take a dead heart and make it spiritually alive. And so our goal is to bring Jesus to people, to show that there's a better king, that there's a better king and a better kingdom and a better principle, a better way to follow, Jesus' way. And so that's the truth. And that's what Jesus brings up next, the truth. He's going to bring up the truth. Pilate heard what Jesus said, and he goes, so you are a king then, Pilate asked. You say that I'm a king, Jesus replied. I was born for this, and I've come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And that's where we'll pause today. We'll let Pilate ask his question about truth next week and unpack that. Jesus says, if you know the truth, you're going to be listening to my voice. And so, my friends, I want to invite us to end today by contemplating the most innocent man that has ever lived, falsely accused, found guilty of crimes he never committed, sentenced to death by crucifixion for which he did not deserve. Isaiah says he was led like a lamb to the slaughter, was silent before his shears, willfully went through it all, endured it all, had you in mind. It was love that kept him on the cross. In Hebrews chapter 12, we're told this, consider him, think about him, ponder him, meditate, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. Why? So that you won't grow weary and give up. Consider him. Think about him. He is our model. He is our example. He's our king. So, let me invite you to close your eyes and bow your heads. Start off with this. Just thank him. Thank him for the way that he loves you. That he didn't quit. He didn't fight back. He didn't tap out. It was his love for you that held him on that cross. It was his love for you that endured a sham of a trial. He didn't fight for his rights. He willfully endured it. Just thank him. And I want you to ask him to sift your heart, particularly around this question. What does it mean to belong to a spiritual kingdom with a spiritual king who gave spiritual principles on how to live while remaining here on this physical earth? Would you just invite God into your heart and say, God, how am I doing living as a spiritual subject to a spiritual king in a spiritual kingdom, but I'm temporarily trapped here on this physical earth. How are you doing meshing those two very different kingdom dynamics? And then ask the king, while you're here, what's my assignment? What's my mission? What's your objective, king, that you want me to carry out? And lastly, just ask him, by what means? By what means do you want me to carry out my mission? I'm going to ask our prayer team to come forward now, and as we have been doing, church, you can stay, just sit quietly, keep letting the Lord speak to your heart. Don't run out on him. Let him speak to your heart. These moments with God are so precious. This is where he wants to speak as a father to his son or to his daughter. So don't be afraid to stay. Maybe some of you, like, I need prayer. I'm all upside down. I'm living in the wrong kingdom, fighting for the wrong kingdom, loving the wrong kingdom. Or just maybe you just have things going on in your life. Like, I need prayer. I need help. I need God to touch my life. Come, let our prayer team pray over you. The rest of you, thank you so much for being here at Next. And if you're new, I'd love to say hello to you, or at least fill out that card if you would. And the rest of you, thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. You're quietly dismissed. God bless.